Okay, so I'm going to reflect a little bit on the results and my own prediction, which, I'm not going to sugarcoat this, was a complete failure. It was possibly the worst prediction I've ever made, even worse than the predictions I made before I really got interested in politics. So it's kind of a moment that I have to reflect myself on why my prediction was so bad, and I can only apologise for that. I mean, it's the fact that I made a bad prediction, to me, suggests that I've misunderstood something quite fundamental about what happened in this election, and I've got to face up to that fact. So, personally, what I think went wrong for the Conservatives is that the assumption that the UKIP voters would overwhelmingly migrate back to the Conservative Party was flawed. I mean, that clearly did not happen. We saw instead quite a lot of UKIP voters that returned to the Labour Party. Perhaps that was to be expected, given that a lot of these voters were originally Labour to begin with. But it was surprising to me that, given the Labour Party's weak and ambiguous stance on issues like Brexit and immigration, that so many UKIP voters, I mean, it doesn't even have to be that many proportionally, so I mean, 30 or 40% of UKIP voters going to Labour was clearly enough, but given their ambiguous stance on key issues like Brexit and immigration, I'm very surprised that happened. Now, it's also the case that the Conservatives were also weak and ambiguous on Brexit and immigration. The campaign in the later stages, the Conservative campaign in the later stages, was clearly not focused on these two fundamental issues that voters cared about. And there's no other way of saying this, but the Conservative campaign was a total disaster. This is something that I have said frequently, but I still didn't think it was enough for the result to go quite as badly as it did. So I'm going to explain how I came to that prediction of 86 majority. So the way I did it was I went through all the seats individually, made a prediction for each and every seat, and I made the predictions based on a few key assumptions, but I tried to ignore the polling companies on the basis that, I mean, I took the polling under advisement, but I tried to ignore a fundamentalist approach, and I tried to avoid relying on the polls, given their past record. But even though going seat-wise has worked for me quite well in the past in other predictions, such as the by-elections, it completely failed this time. And the main reason I think it failed is that a lot of my predictions that would have led to that massive Conservative majority were based in these sort of key marginal seats between Labour and the Conservative, where Labour came first with, say, 16 or 18,000 votes. UKIP would come second with perhaps 12,000 votes, and the Conservatives would be a little behind on maybe 10,000 votes. What I thought was that all the polls suggested that the Conservatives would pick up about 50% of the UKIP votes, at least 50%, and that was considered to be a conservative estimate. So, factoring in those accounts, factoring that into account, that would push so many Labour seats into Conservative seats across the country, and that was even assuming that the other parties, such as the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, and so on, all tactically voted for Labour. If we assumed that 50% of the UKIP voters went to the Conservative Party, and still were quite generous towards Labour, even factoring in small sort of swings from the Labour to the Conservative, from the Conservative to the Labour Party, it would still stand that the Conservatives would make mass gains in England. But that did not happen, clearly. So a lot of the assumptions that went into my predictions were completely wrong. And I think, despite the fact that I claimed to be independent of the polls, I think part of the issue was that one of the most important assumptions at all that I made in my prediction, which was that a large percentage of this UKIP contingent would go to the Conservatives turned out to be completely wrong. So I think the main thing to reflect on this is that I was under the illusion that I was independent from the polls, but that was not the case. I was not taking the polling numbers, the percentages for granted, but I was still using information from the polls, insofar as assuming that the 50% of the UKIP vote would go to the Conservatives. Of course, that wasn't the only place I got it wrong. I also underestimated how well the Conservatives would do in Scotland, and I frankly overestimated how well the SNP would do in Scotland. And I really have no idea why that happened. Of course, the polls were. I mean, actually, ironically, I deviated more from the polls in Scotland by suggesting that the SNP would hold on to a lot of what they had. So actually, that went the other way for me. I think what must have happened is that the Scottish people are clearly sick of this prospect of a second referendum. So there was this sort of tactical voting towards the unionist parties, and that in many cases happened to be the Conservatives. So I wonder whether the Scotland result was more of a unionist backlash rather than a particular surge for the Tories. But again, I don't know. I'll have to look into that. So this has been a failure on my part, and I really do apologise for that. I can't say this. So it's a moment of solace for me about this. My prediction was completely out, and you know, so I just want to admit that. Okay, so next, I guess I want to talk about what this means for the country. So I suppose it's kind of obvious at this point that there's going to have to be some kind of deal between the Conservative Party and the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, who did pretty well in Northern Ireland by picking up two seats. So the DUP was a Eurosceptic party, so superficially this seems like it's quite optimistic for Brexiteers in the sense that they're in a coalition with a party that shares many of their aims, at least as far as Brexit goes, which is one of the more important issues. The DUP will, however, also want a soft border with Ireland. Now, I think when we entered the Brexit negotiations, this was probably going to happen anyway. I don't think anyone seriously desired a hard border with Ireland. I don't think this was ever seriously on the table. So this kind of compromise was going to have to be come to anyway. So in many ways, the fact that the DUP will be lobbying for this soft border with Ireland, it is in many ways a good thing, because it's an issue that has to be sorted out anyway. So it will be quite good to get this sorted out as quickly as possible. So, secondly, I think I find it difficult to see how Theresa May could stay after this result, but the pragmatics might make it difficult for her to be ousted. The Brexit negotiations start in 10 days, so it's difficult to see how there can be a leadership election in these circumstances. What might happen is that she will continue on for a while, and then there'll be a leadership election this autumn. I think her position is clearly untenable, but that the practicalities make it difficult for the Conservatives to get rid of her. But they will be gunning for her, so I think she is going to have to go sooner or later, although it might be later rather than sooner. So there's going to be an election at some point. It might be in 2022. If these negotiations fall through, if there's no compromise anywhere, if the EU refuses to make any concessions, if Ireland refuses to, the prospect of, for example, customs checks at the ports and airports in Ireland, and the DUP doesn't compromise on a soft border with Ireland, which I think that there won't be a compromise on that particular issue, then we could end up in a situation where the alliance falls apart and we would have to have another general election. I'm not sure how likely this is. I don't really want to make a prediction regarding it, but it clearly is on the table. And in such an election, Labour, we should not rule out the possibility of a Labour majority if there's a second election, because the UKIP vote that went to the Conservatives, that was always going to be on loan. What surprised me is the fact that so much of it went to Labour Party initially, but the part that did go to the Conservatives, we shouldn't take that for granted. Even that vote should not be taken for granted. So Labour could still do pretty well if there was another snap election. I don't think the people have any desire for another election. It just might be that the situation means that there's no alternative. So it's difficult to see how this would all pan out. Now, does this mean, is this a victory for the Remain side? No, it isn't. Labour campaigned on exiting the single market, as did the Conservatives. The only parties which wanted to stay in the single market, the only relevant parties that wanted to stay in the single market, were the SNP and the Liberal Democrats. The SNP failed miserably, and the Liberal Democrats sort of, they had a mixed performance, but they really made no progress in Remain areas either. They gained a couple of seats, but they're still pretty much where they started, largely in irrelevancy. So this is not a victory for the Remain camp either, particularly since the Labour vote was enhanced so much by this UKIP redefections, and of course UKIP voters are pro-Leave. So this should not be taken as evidence that the UK is regretting Brexit. Clearly, the UK does not regret Brexit in the sense that both parties are pro-Brexit. The parties that weren't are gone. Well, are less relevant now. The SNP, of course, is also in trouble for another reason. They wanted a second referendum on Brexit, and that's clearly off the table now. So Scotland will have, the SNP is going to have a lot less power to bargain on that. So, and what about the DUP? Well, the DUP has been sending mixed messages about its view on the single market. They don't want free movement. They want control of our fisheries. They want control of our laws. The DUP seems to be advocating for us to leave the single market on this basis, on the way that they campaigned in Brexit, but they also want a soft border. So this becomes an issue. I mean, and in fact, the leader of the DUP has advocated for a soft Brexit. But I think when they did that, well, I think when she advocated for a soft Brexit, she was talking about the border issue with Ireland anyway. So this is complicated, but it should not be taken as our victory for the Remain camp. It should be taken as a victory for Jeremy Corbyn's style of anti-establishment politics and a failure on behalf of Theresa May's quasi Hillary Clinton style, status quo banality. Anyway, apologies once again for the failure of my prediction, and these are my reflections and thoughts.